It was,
How do you look so good in Zoom though? Like you look like perfect.
do you
Oh
know,
my god, stop.
I'm here with Stephanie Quintana, who is a photographer and artistic director and designer. And we're talking as part of my conversation series I'm calling In Her Image, which is a series of conversations I've been hosting with women who, through their work, through their individuality, express sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, but an inherent feminism because they're being really uniquely themselves and seeing the world in their own way, not jamming it into an existing form. And I'm really excited that Stephanie is joining me here today. These conversations are part of a residency I'm having with Gazelle Art House and Gazelle.io. And the whole conversation will be archived, but also I'm pulling out 15-second, 30-second segments to share on Instagram, where significantly more people seem to see them, which is wonderful. So, Stephanie, I'm really happy that you agreed to be part of this conversation with me. I've known you for a number of years, and one of my favorite things about doing these conversations is I'm talking to a lot of women who I know and who I admire, but I'm learning a lot about them in the process. And I'd love for you to start by sharing just a little about your story, where you grew up, what you're doing now, and we can get into some of the specifics, specifically around. I'm really interested in you sharing with more people your theories and interests in fantasy of the model and the different forms that modelings can take, and that your perspective as a photographer, and then also how that's translated to your job at Everlane. But yeah, please, we'll get into all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of it's like nice that I'm actually here in LA, which is my hometown. And so much of Los Angeles has kind of like permeated my work, like it's storytelling and it is that idea of fantasy. And I grew up in an area of Los Angeles that most people don't know. It's called Pacoima. It is a pretty impoverished neighborhood, which meant that my parents found very interesting ways of getting me to not go outside. One of which was they taught me how to use a camera really young. And so I was allowed to like set up sets, and basically my brothers and sisters became props and models. I'm multi-ethnic. I'm Japanese, Spaniard, Mexican, and Black. And my grandmother, who is Japanese, left us a bunch of kimonos. And so I would often use those kimonos in order to like dress up my siblings and do these kind of elaborate photo shoots. And yeah, so like growing up in an area where you really saw like the difference of like I went to a very wealthy school and then I would come home to this kind of impoverished area, and you saw the way people viewed themselves and the stories in which they were left out of. And for me, I was at a kind of a young age very sensitive to the idea that I wasn't seeing myself in the stories around me. And that had a really interesting effect on how I viewed the world and what I wanted to do within the world, which was always this kind of how do I place people like me within stories. And in that way you bridge a gap, you start to create places of like unity, and places where people see themselves and other people see them, and it becomes a place of value setting. But yeah, I mean, being in LA, I think you just kind of, it permeates every part of you, this idea that you should tell stories, and you should tell stories that are interesting and different.
And you mentioned just briefly this, placing people that you weren't seeing. You're seeing people around you that weren't existing in the stories that you were seeing in media. You were learning to operate a camera. You were learning that this is something that you could control. Can you talk about the way that sense of control and power behind the camera struck you when you were young, or how did you feel? How does the idea of control relate to this?
I don't think it's as much about control as it is about finding power and empowering yourself to be able to not feel necessarily that just because you don't fit a particular standard of beauty. And at the time, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so there weren't as many people of color within magazines and within like mass media. And so being behind the camera allowed me to empower myself and empower my friends who were, you know, the people growing up in this neighborhood to feel special and beautiful and create these like small narratives around them, and around this idea of fantasy, because I do believe that in that place, it's like our highest, one of our like highest forms of art is putting somebody within, you know, the fantastic world, whether that be a fairy tale or a movie screen. And to tell a story that is heroic around that body allows other people to see that body as heroic. So when you see, you know, a woman in hijab, but you've seen a story about her being like, you know, a mother and a daughter, you then relate to her in that way versus seeing her as scary. And I believe that like you empower people by being behind the lens to tell a story and to be seen as special and heroic and somebody of value.
I remember when we were first talking about this, you mentioned like, oh, you know, that sort of like fairy, wafy, skinny, white sort of image of the fairy was very vivid in the way that you were initially describing this to me. And was that something that you knew early on was just a decision of, like you said, power and choice, or did you go through a period of questioning whether or not you and people from different backgrounds belonged there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was something I kind of like naturally came to because it seemed to be this like idyllic place. It was like the most, in a way, I hate the word pure, but in a way, it's like this very pure place. There's no like, it's not sexualized and it's not, you know, there's things about it that are just so neutral in its beauty. When you think of a Tim Walker photograph, you don't necessarily think of like, it's not Helmut Newton, you know, like you're thinking of something that feels more whimsical. And I found that like especially the black and brown body is often hypersexualized. And to put it in a place of just pure whimsy and pure fantasy allowed it to be elevated in a way that was so far removed from that place of hypersexualization, which I also found to be, you know, when you see often those bodies, you know, you think of there's certain stereotypes around them that are so derogatory as far as like sexualization. So I felt that it was kind of a natural place for me to progress to, which was, you know, how do I take this body that I have and possess and other people have and not make it an object, like not make it into like something that you crave or lust after, but something that you admire.
That's a perfect bridge to, um, you're often behind the camera or behind a creative designer or set, but you also take a lot of photographs of yourself. You seem to have what I'd consider to be like a self-muse relationship as well. Is that something that just developed out of some of your influences, out of current culture, mood board? What's the root of that?
I mean, I think it started quite young with like, I used to have a Polaroid camera and I would like take photos of myself with the Polaroid. And I think it happened because I was the only subject I had. And it was the thing in person that I had access to. And I was the person, like I was I was the muse that I wanted to create, which was this like body that was, you know, different than what I'd seen. And so I was like, of course, you always kind of use the thing that you have immediate access to, which is often yourself. And I just kind of did it. And I feel like me in a selfie is like a persona that is not necessarily like me in real life. I feel like she's a little bit sexier than me. And it was always fun. It's always fun to play pretend. And I think that place of like playing pretend is so important just to life in general, of like being able to kind of tap into a place that isn't necessarily grounded in just pure reality.
That idea of playing a role and exploring femininity or sexuality or subjectness through the camera and through Instagram, I think is really interesting. And now that you mention that, I can absolutely see how that plays out. It's almost like having like one foot in awareness and one foot in play, and kind of putting that out into the world. And I have this theory, not just, I mean, theory is probably a strong word for it, but I think, and one of the things I love doing with these conversations is I think there are a lot of women like us who love the aesthetic of Instagram, love kind of fantasy and girliness, but also don't want it to detract from our self-awareness and intellectual side of it. This is one of the reasons why I love sharing these conversations on Instagram, is I don't feel like these worlds and these platforms need to be set into these different modes. Just because you look a certain way or you use a certain aesthetic in a set doesn't mean that it doesn't have a lot of thought behind it.
Yeah.
So in your story, at one point, you went from having these intuitions, working behind the camera, to very rigorous study around these topics of subjectivity and diversity in photography, and talk about your education.
Yes, so I went to UCLA Fine Arts, and I also studied a little bit in the World Arts and Cultures program. And I also am just, like, one of my absolute favorite theorists is Edouard Glissant and his idea of like relation. I also, love the Constructivist Manifesto. I'm a diehard philosophy fan. I love diving in there, and so much of it was often separate from like the ideas that I had around photography, but there were things about it that I could apply to what I was doing. And I do take very like whimsical photos. They're not, they're not serious. They're not like, you don't look at them and go, this is about like the black body or the brown body. That's not what I'm trying to do necessarily at the forefront. But for me, the photographic space is a human rights space. It's a place in which we put the people that we find to be of value into the most like kind of like, it's the highest podium we can put them on. And when I realized, after like, you do so much study and you see the ways in which we have subjugated, people of color, and we find that those stories that we tell around them are still often ones of subjugation, of abuse, and though those things are true and they happen and they're part of the narrative of being somebody of color, especially in the United States, it is not the full story. And so for me, being able to like bridge the gap of like, there are heroic stories and there are beautiful stories and there are people in these places and of these backgrounds that you can admire, allows for us as individuals to collectively coalesce around the idea that all bodies are of value, all bodies are beautiful, and it allows us to stop separating, this our idealized form of beauty being one thing, but actually it's a multiplicity of things, and in that multiplicity we're able to start to, in real life, move past our like outside biases. And so for me, as I started to really like dive into, what is relationism and what does it mean to construct? And I found that you're taking all these little pieces of culture and identity and you're creating something new. You're creating a world in which in-betweenness is everything, where there isn't an exclusivity to the perfect image. And so much of my work and so much of what I do, even as an artistic director, has to do with being a little bit subversive in how I cast. I'm like, how do I like make this story like include somebody that shouldn't be, quote unquote, shouldn't be there? And it's one of my favorite parts about what I do is like, I have this background that most people don't know is my operating system, but it informs every decision I make, from the way that I ask my stylist to style, to the person that I put in the image. And it is all about this idea of this space that we exist in. Like right now, you're on a screen and I'm on a screen, and you're going to post that. And somebody somewhere is going to be like, oh, I can also do that. I'm a girl who didn't know that people like me can also do these things and say these things. And for me, that's always been, what I want to do. I want to be able to be like, this space that we exist in behind the camera and in front of the camera is for everybody.
I really love the idea of fantasy expressed in your work as well. And I think like some of our conversations a few months ago got me thinking. I'd already been making these vision boards. I'd been going down this path, but the power of that, like in artificial intelligence, we have a whole set of technologies that are learning how to define and create worlds only on what has been. And so if there aren't images of certain bodies in fantasy modes, or my example is always like, if you were to try and ask artificial intelligence to predict what the next president's going to look like, it's only going to be able to look at past images. Mm-hmm. It's inherently backward looking. And so I've become really, really interested in images of possibility as training tools. Both when we see it play out in AI, it's so much obvious about the way it plays out in our own intelligences and our own. Yeah. It's maybe just less like, it's so direct, it's so immediate that this is an issue in our brains as much as in technologies. So when you took this, I'm going to call it a philosophy or a set of values, and you went from, you were always, to my understanding, doing both, but now working in an artistic direction full time, or as a career, along with doing photography for a variety of clients for yourself. I loved that you said that you like to get in this idea of subversion. Talk a little bit more about that, and a little bit about whatever you can talk about in your current work.
Yeah, so I love the idea of like AI being like this thing that's trying to like predict the future based on only what it has access to, which is like the coolest thing about intelligence and about being people, is that we create out of nothing. We spontaneously create futures constantly. So it's an interesting like thought experiment, and like something we're seeing play out. But yeah, so in my current role, as much as I can get into it, so as a photographer, you're often at the whim of what your artistic and creative director want you to do. So you can have a point of view, but you're often, unless it's your own work, doing what somebody else wants you to do. And so as it became apparent that I really wanted to be able to make those larger decisions, I needed to push forward and move away from directly behind the lens to a place where I can make bigger decisions. And so that's why I kind of started to push in that direction. I got the opportunity to work at Everlane a few months ago, and it seemed like kind of this like perfect place, because they are very much about like the generation that I exist in. It's this idea of clothes that make life simpler, and I found that place tends to have a particular look, and for me, I was like, how do I make this look more inclusive? And it's also about the idea of like, this is also a company that's very green. I mean, they are really on the edge of like, how do we make environmentally friendly clothing? And it's also, quite affordable. And I was like, it's a shame that it also feels like it's still limited to one particular group of people who are environmentally friendly. And that's partly because it felt like we were representing all the people that are actually interested in the environment and are affected by this. And so it became really important to me that I start to really push casting and diversity, because the world that we exist in is not just black and white, it's black, white, beige, and like this crazy spectrum. And all of us are clearly affected by the environment and by the climate that we exist in. And so yeah, it was just like, it kind of was like a natural progression from knowing that I wanted to have control over who gets seen, and realizing that in order to do that, you have to be the person who decides who gets seen. So I took this position, and it's been really cool. It's like been a very cool experience to be within a company that is so conscious of that as well. Like they are trying to constantly better themselves, and like any young company, there's starts and fits.
Another theme I've been exploring with a lot of people I've been speaking to is this, I would call it the current of activism, where you didn't take your job to be an activist, you don't become to be an activist out of a lot of personal reasons, but because there is something you really care about, it comes across and can be very interpreted as activism. And it's interesting to speak about the environment in that thread as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think as any person who has like a point of view, and I think that it's often, as like a woman, as a woman of color, as you find yourself in a place where even if you don't necessarily want to be an activist, existing within a place where you're probably the only brown person automatically puts you in a position of standing up and being an example to others, which isn't often a fair position, but like one that you find being like, okay, well, I'm here, so what can I do?
Can you talk a little bit more about, you talked a lot about cultural background and ethnicity within photography. What about gender? A lot of, especially fashion photographers, are male, and that relationship has a lot to do with power and the way that products have been presented for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those places that many of the photographers in the fashion world are still white and still male. And it's starting to shift. You're starting to see more women in it, but it also comes down to access to, you don't often see that many women of color behind the lens. I think I can name 2 off the top of my head that are actually in fashion photography and not in fine art photography. And a lot of that comes down to being able to even know that that's a career to follow. When you think of, where most people of color get educated, there's not very many arts programs in those places. And so you're starting from a deficit in a lot of ways. And so I think that it's a weird place. There's not access to it at a young age. There's not access to arts education. So how can you see yourself as a photographer or as an artist, or know that's a way forward? It's a very privileged thing to go to art school and to kind of like take a risk, right? Like going to art school is like risky. There's no guarantee that you're going to make money doing it. It's going to cost you a lot of money to do it. And um, I think I have like an antidote, which probably brings this. It's much easier for me to explain. I was at a dinner probably like 5 or 6 years ago, and I looked around the table, and I was the only brown woman at this table. It was like a bunch of creatives. It was a bunch of people in the arts. And I like got up at one point to like go to the restroom, and the maid asked me if her daughter could say hello to me. And I was like, of course. And she's like, well, she really loves fashion, and she loves your outfit, and she wants to say hi. And I was like, yeah, of course. And so she comes out and she's like, I really like your outfit. She's like very shy and very like soft spoken. And I realized in that moment, she was also like, you are in the place, you're at the table and you're in this place. And I can now, I admire that, and I can aspire to that because I now know that it exists. I can do fashion, I can do this thing. And I think that for me, that was like such a moment of being like, my existence there opens a door. And the more people that can see that the door is open, the more people that can come through. And that starts to change that dynamic of having only white male photographers, because you start to see that you can also do it. This little girl goes, oh, there's a seat at the table for me. And you kind of like leave your foot in the door for the next person to come through. And that's always been a part of like my philosophy as a photographer and as an art director, is I'm always trying to find ways of bringing other people through the door.